She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. I looked at her, I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her. You know? It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. And in a rage, I went right back in. I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. I got physically ill right then, when she died, when I murdered her.
The 1970s were a very active time for serial killers and cults in America. Ed Kemper, the Golden State Killer, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson and his family, the Zodiac, John Wayne Gacy, the Son of Sam, Jim Jones and the People's Cult, Jeffrey Dahmer, BTK, and Sam Little, just to name a very few of the most well-known. It was a terrifying time here in the U.S. If you've watched the show Mindhunter, you got to feel what it was like being in the presence of some of these serial killers, and Cameron Britton really killed the part as Ed Kemper.
I would not allow myself to walk into even a potential trap.
I would not allow myself to walk into a trap.
And one of those was talking about those crimes too much.
The classic is talking too much about the crimes. It's a pretty girl, pretty name. Kim or something. Going out on a date.
Where I'd love to be going.
Consuming my insides, this fantastic passion. I knew a week before she died I was gonna kill her.
I knew a week before she died I was gonna kill her.
She went out to a party,
she got soused.
She came home alone.
I was woken up by that. I came out.
You know, that night I
walked up to her bed.
She's laying there reading a paperback. As many thousands of nights before.
He's an American serial killer and necrophile who was dubbed the Co-Ed Killer because of the havoc that he wreaked on the women attending the University of California in 1972 and 73. He murdered a total of 10 people. One of the most fascinating things about Ed Kemper for me is that he's incredibly self-aware and he loves to talk. He's gone on many rants about how he felt before, during, and after his attacks, and what, in his mind, led him down that dark and twisty path. You can't talk about a serial killer without going into a little bit of backstory. Like so many other serial killers, Ed Kemper's childhood molded him into the monster that he turned out to be, and he showed all of the classic signs at an early age. Ed Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. He had an older sister and a younger sister. His parents were Edmund Kemper II and Clarnell Kemper. His parents split when he was only 9 years old. They described their marriage as loveless and damaging. Ed Kemper II went as far as saying that, quote, "Suicide missions during wartime and atomic bomb testing were nothing compared to living with Clarnell Kemper," end quote. So after his parents split, Ed Kemper and his two sisters moved to Montana with their mother, and their father stayed in California, and eventually he remarried. Ed's mom remarried soon after their move, and a year and a half later, the second husband left her. And then she was married again 2 years later. Ed's mother, Clarnell, wasn't a nice lady. She drank a lot and ridiculed him regularly. She physically and verbally abused him and told him that no woman could ever love him. She didn't treat her other children this way, only Ed. I'm not sure if it was because he was a boy or if he reminded her of her ex-husband, but he always thought that she hated him, and she had told him that she did often. Ed's mother had told some of her friends that she feared him because when he was 15, he was already 6'4". She made him sleep in the locked basement because she was worried that he would harm her or his sisters in their sleep. At the age of 10, Ed Kemper killed and decapitated the family cat. Ed would admit later that around the same time he was fantasizing about killing his older sister. Later, his sisters said that Ed would make them play a game with them that he called gas chamber. He would tie them up and blindfold them and then scream in agony until his sisters pretended to die. Yeah, this sounds like a blast, right? In second grade, he would stalk his teacher and follow her home armed with his father's bayonet knife. But he wasn't quite ready to act on his impulses just yet. Ed says that when he was 8 or 9, he went to a magic show where the magician was looking for a volunteer from the audience to put their head into a guillotine and pretend to have it cut off. He says the woman that went up was a teenager and was so beautiful and smiling and laughing, and he was just fascinated. By the way he described this experience in one of his prison interviews, you can tell that it was a huge staple and memory in his childhood. This is where his obsession started with decapitation. At 13, he buried a family cat alive because it favored his older sister. Ed described 2 near-death experiences that he had at the hands of his older sister. He said that she tried to push him in front of a train when he was a kid, and the same sister also pushed him into the deep end of a swimming pool before he could swim. This just made his hatred for his sister grow that much more. When Ed was 14, he ran away from his mother's home in Montana to his dad's in Van Nuys, California. He wasn't with his dad for very long before he wore out his welcome and his dad sent him to live with his paternal grandparents. His father said that he sent him away from his house because of the stress that Ed was causing his new wife. Ed says that his grandmother was just as cruel to him as his mother had been. On August 27, 1964, Ed had been living with his grandparents for about 10 months. He was 15 and stood at a whopping 6'4". Ed and his grandmother were in the kitchen and had gotten into some sort of an argument. His grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table and he went and got his grandfather's handgun. He came back up behind her and shot her 3 times in the back of the head. Ed's grandfather had been out running errands, and when Ed heard him pull up, he decided that he should kill his grandfather too to save him the pain of finding out what had happened to his wife. So he met his grandfather outside before he made it into the house and also shot him in the head. Ed called his mother and asked what he should do. She told him that he should call the police and that if he didn't, she would. So he turned himself in. When the police took him into custody and asked him why he had shot his grandparents, he said, quote, "to see what it felt like." Kemper was convicted for both homicides and was analyzed by court-appointed mental health professionals. They indicated that he had paranoid schizophrenia, so he was sent to a maximum security mental hospital so that he could get the help that he needed. During the time that he was incarcerated, Ed was given an IQ test and he scored 136. Later, when he took the test again, he scored 140. Now, an average score is only 100, and 68% of people score between 85 and 115. A low IQ would be 70 or below, and anything 130 or higher is considered a high IQ. Random fact, Einstein's IQ was 160 or higher. So this meant that Ed Kemper had close to a genius-level IQ. This only fed his ego and confirmed in his manipulative, narcissistic little mind that he was smarter than everyone else. Ed was described as a model prisoner, and after spending only 5 years locked up for the murders of his grandparents, he was released in 1969 on his 21st birthday. His juvenile record was expunged and just wiped clean. It was like it never happened. Ed didn't have many options, so he went to live with his mother. She had taken a job at the University of California and moved back to California at some point while he was locked up. The clinicians that had been treating Ed at the hospital strongly advised against it, but he moved to Santa Cruz and in with his mother. When Ed was released, he was classified as being low risk for offending again, but still had to check in with probation regularly. He and his mother were, again, unable to get along and live together. She continued to belittle and degrade him every chance that she got. Ed's mother didn't like the fact that he was a loner and that he hadn't achieved more of a social status in his life. She didn't seem too upset about him murdering her ex-husband's parents, but she didn't like the fact that he didn't have many friends. I mean, he had been locked up for the last 5 or 6 years. How could he have achieved a different social status? She just looked for every way she could to knock him lower and lower. Ed Kemper had always wanted to be a police officer, but exceeded their height requirements. I had no idea that there were height requirements to be a police officer, but I guess it makes sense. Ed was 6'9" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Even though he wasn't permitted to join the police force, he made friends with several police officers and would hang out at a local bar with all of them. They gave him the nickname of Big Ed. Ed worked several different jobs over the following years and even attended a small community college for a short period of time. He would periodically return to his mother's house when he ran out of money or needed a place to stay. In 1971, he began working for the California Department of Highway and Transportation and was finally able to move out of his mother's apartment for good, or so he thought. Ed had bought a motorcycle and was in an accident with a car and had gotten injured, so he received a settlement from the other driver in the amount of $15,000. With the money, he bought a new car that looked like an undercover, unmarked police patrol car. This is about the time that he began to pick up hitchhikers and allegedly picked up around 150 hitchhikers that he drove to the places that they wanted to go and dropped them off safe and unharmed. He says he used these hitchhikers as a way to perfect his technique of getting women into his car and how to speak to them to make them trust him. Then, in May of 1972, Kemper picked up two 18-year-old women named Mary Ann and Anita. He had seen them hitchhiking and took them to a secluded area near a park and murdered both of them. He had hidden the gun under his leg parallel with his leg while the girls got into the car. He took one girl into the woods while the other stayed tied up in his car. Mary Ann and Anita's families reported them missing, and on August 15th, a woman's decapitated head was found in a wooded area in Santa Cruz, and it was later determined to be Mary Ann's head. Anita's remains have never been found. Kemper said later that he tried to strangle Mary Ann, but it wasn't working, so he slit her throat and decided to cut her head off and admitted to stabbing and killing Anita too. He brought the bodies back to his home and removed their hands and heads, and also admitted to engaging in sexual acts with their corpses. A few months later, on September 14, 1972, Ed picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, who was also hitchhiking. Aiko had gotten weird vibes from Kemper and tried to escape the car, but Ed obviously overpowered her and taped her mouth shut, and then put his fingers in her nostrils to try to suffocate her. When that didn't work, he took the scarf off of her neck and strangled her with it. After Aiko passed, he engaged in sexual acts with her corpse as well. He put her body into the trunk of his car and took it with him to the bar to hang out with all of the local police officers. After the bar, he took her body back to his house and spent the night removing her head and hands and dismembering her body. He took Aiko's head and hands with him to run his errands for that day and had them in a plastic bag in his car. He had a court-mandated sit-down with the clinicians that he had been working with on his case and was able to convince them that he was not a threat to himself or anyone else. His juvenile record was officially expunged. At this point, his body count was 5. His 2 paternal grandparents and the 3 female hitchhikers that they didn't know about yet. On January 19th of 73, he picked up yet again another hitchhiker named Cindy. This time, he decided that he was going to shoot her since he was starting to see that it was harder to strangle someone than he had always assumed. Ed took Cindy's body back to his mother's home and hid her body in his bedroom. He decapitated her and dismembered her body before doing what he did to all of his other victims. The following day, he disposed of Cindy's body parts in the ocean, minus her head, which he buried in his mother's backyard, and methodically placed her head in a position so that it would be facing his mother's bedroom. Ed said that he did this because his mother always wanted people to look up to her.
I know it's silly, but Mom always liked people to look up to her. Whoa.
This guy. Police finally put out a warning against hitchhiking, and the college campus increased their bus schedule in an effort to keep the young women from needing to hitchhike to get where they wanted or needed to go.
Ironically, one warning advised riding only in cars with university stickers. Kemper's car had such a sticker.
My mother worked at the campus, and I had an A sticker on my car, and obvious access day or night to the campus. I was picking up some very lovely young women.
Kemper said that he and the young woman he was picking up would often talk about the maniac that was going around killing these co-eds. They would talk about what he must look like and what kind of person he would be. Kemper said that the women continued to get into his car because they judged him not to be that guy, and because he didn't look like they thought he would.
You know what we were talking about as we're driving around? Almost as often as not. This guy that's going around doing this stuff. She judged me not to be that guy. I didn't look like him.
On February 5th of 73, Kemper got into an argument with his mother. He left his house and took his mother's parking pass. and picked up 2 female hitchhikers. They thought they were safe because the police had said to only take rides from someone who had that sticker. Ed was irate from the argument with his mother. He thought that the next good-looking girl he saw hitchhiking would die. He saw 2 women walking together and was attracted to both of them. He picked up 21-year-old Rosalind and 23-year-old Allison and shot and killed both of them with a .22 caliber automatic pistol. Kemper said that he would typically stop the car and kill the woman wherever it was that he decided to stop. But on this particular day, he was so full of rage that he didn't even bother stopping the car. He was still driving when he shot Allison several times in the backseat of the car. Then he shot Rosalind at point-blank range in the passenger seat, again while he was still driving. He pulled into a quiet cul-de-sac and placed both women's bodies into the trunk of his car. He took them back to the house that he shared with his mother and decapitated them and dismembered their bodies. He also removed the bullets from the women's heads after he decapitated them. He disposed of their body parts in different locations.
It was getting easier to do. I was getting better at it. I was getting less detectable. I started flaunting that invisibility, severing a human head, 2 of them, at night in front of my mother's residence.
In March, a few hikers came across human heads close to Highway 1 and called the police. Then, in April of '73, 24-year-old Kemper committed his last 2 murders. After yet another argument with his mother, Ed waited for her to fall asleep before he attacked her with a claw hammer and beat her to death. After he killed his mother, he decapitated her and proceeded to angrily scream at her head for about an hour before he used it as a dartboard, and then he made it perform oral sex on him. Ed Kemper is very obviously a seriously deranged and sadistic monster, but what he did to his mother is just on a whole nother level for me. He cut out her tongue and her voice box and placed them into the garbage disposal. It wouldn't break them up and kept spitting them back out into the sink. Kemper went out for a few drinks and then invited his mother's friend Sally to come over to the house for dinner. When she arrived, he strangled her and hid her body in a closet inside of the house. He, of course, performed sexual acts with her corpse later that evening before finally fleeing the area in Sally's car. He drove a few hours and then stopped at a rental car place and traded cars. He drove for another 18 hours, only stopping for gas and drinks. Kemper drove all the way to Colorado before he called the Santa Cruz police to try to confess to the murders. Like I said, he was friends with a lot of them, and they didn't believe him. They knew him as Big Ed. So he requested to speak to a specific officer that he knew didn't like him and thought that he was a creep because he knew this officer would believe that he was capable of what he was claiming to have done. Eventually, they believed his story and sent Colorado officers out to arrest him, who turned him back over to the Santa Cruz Police Department. Ed Kemper took the police on a little field trip and led them to all of the evidence that he was, in fact, the co-ed killer. He confessed to all 8 of the murders in great detail. He was literally right in front of them this entire time. Ed Kemper was finally arrested in April of 1973 at the young age of 24 years old. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. His trial started in October of '73, and in early November, he was found guilty of all 8 charges. He was sentenced to 8 concurrent life sentences. Ed Kemper did a prison interview for the Cosmopolitan magazine. The interviewer asked him how he feels when he sees an attractive woman now. Ed replied with, quote, "Part of me thinks that I would like to speak to her and maybe date her, but another part of me wonders what her head will look like on a stick." At the time of me recording this video, Ed Kemper is still in the California Medical Facility State Prison in Vacaville. He's described as a model prisoner and was even teaching computer sciences to the other inmates in the prison for a while. He says that he loves answering his fan mail. He just turned 72 years old in December and was up for parole in 2017. He obviously was denied. He's been denied for parole several times, and in his last parole hearing, he tried to take back his confession, saying that he was immature when he confessed. It's a little too late for that, buddy. Let me know down below if you have a favorite serial killer. I'm curious. I'll see you all down in the comments. Peace and love.